It's January the 23rd, 2023. I'm Dana Durnford. I'm also known as the nuclear proctologist.org. The nuclear industry calls me the gamma goat. You can call me at 709-589-4406. I hope everybody has a great day today in this messed up world. A great show for everybody today. Tons and tons of madness from the nuclear industry. AKA just another day in Nut Land. Does the nuclear industry really have to be so... I don't know if there's a proper Machiavellian, but there's another word for what they're doing. Stupid, I think, is the word. That's the definition of stupid. You're growing food alongside of 1-ton bags of radiation. You definitely lost the plot. Okay, we got some great stories. If there's such a thing as a great story when it comes to nuclear, I got to learn to rephrase stuff like that. Let's kick it off. Always takes me a moment or 3 or 4 to get up to bashing speed. Nuclear industry is out of control. Welcome to everybody worldwide. Hope you have a wicked day today and tomorrow. You have to treat the nuclear industry as a meteorite. It is a meteorite. It's on its way. It's ready to damage you beyond repairs. If you made it to my site, consider subscribing. Click that bell on scumbag YouTube, degenerate YouTube. I don't know, you'll get unsubscribed is what we're seeing. An absurd amount of people get unsubscribed. Repeatedly, I might add. Their thumbs up don't register. We had 1 thumbs up in the last 20 hours on my last video. It was 3 all weekend on my weekend video. How is that even possible? I'm on YouTube. Unfortunately, I'm not everywhere else. It's too much work for me. If you do decide to support me on other social networking sites, guess who's going to visit you? Not the Hulk, and it's not Spider-Man. It's definitely not Spider-Man or Batman or... Krypton is a dangerous isotope, by the way. That's dangerous. It disassociates the children from the real heroes in their communities and their families. He's immune to radiation. Must be nice to be immune to radiation. Must be nice to be immune to radiation. They got so many heroes that the parents can't compete. Big brothers, big sisters can't compete. Aunts and uncles can't compete with all the heroes. And they destroyed the word hero with GoPro heroes and guitar heroes. So they broke the culture, the bond of family is what they're up to, obviously. Not what else would explain it. By the way, that's why we got a electric chair. And in the old days, we used to get rid of our problems. That was the end of the problem. Now we suck our thumb and pretend that we have no power. It's a real mistake. The nuclear industry has captured your medias. And for 80 years, you've been fed a horrific, sadistic betrayal, absurd betrayal. We got an inspiring story of activists to cover right away.
Maybe worse than thought. Studies from...
Now we got a poll. We'll touch on that right away. Should the pro-nuclear be grinded up to feed to the species now that they've killed off the oceans, not just the Pacific, but the ocean's food chain? One of the ways they done that, this is a study from Germany, of the dispersal. Now the model is based on a flawed model.
Maybe worse than thought. Studies from last year indicate that radioactive water will contaminate the entire Pacific Ocean in just 6 years. Kim Min-ji reports.
That's 4 years ago.
This graphic shows the gradual contamination of the Pacific Ocean due to leaks of radioactive water from the crippled Fukushima nuclear plant in Japan. The simulation, which was run by a German marine research institute, shows the entire Pacific waters being polluted by radioactive water in just 6 years.
Right, and this is a 2013 study. So 2019, they estimated that the ocean would be completely full of radioactivity from Japan. The model is not based on the nuclear meltdowns or the 8 fuel pools we know were missing, which each had 4 decades of reactor cores into them. So this is a model from France. I like to use this model. It's a 16-day model of the radioactive fallout based on venting. It's not based on the reactor cores that melted down to tons and tons and millions of pounds in each of the 8 fuel pools. And so at 16 days, the whole planet is covered. The radiation is permanent. So this is why we got a poll. Should the pro-nuclear be ground up to feed the species now that they killed the Pacific? And what I done, I was proactive. We done the research expeditions from Vancouver, British Columbia to Alaska. It wasn't, it was rarely this nice. This was an exception. Usually it was pretty miserable. This was a typical day on the research expeditions, 4 to 5 months a year. My trusty sidekick. And this was the typical end of a day. I'll show you the results from the expeditions, and then you can probably understand why we got the poll the way we do tonight. This was daily. I used to go out for 3, 4, 5 months at a time. It was horrific. I still have, well, I don't regret it, but I have bad memories. Because here's what I discovered. The species to your left are exterminated. This is 2011 and pre-2011 to the left. These are authentic before and after pictures. So is the nuclear industry worth the species on your right? Was that worth sacrificing for your climate change fable? Because it's a fable. Was it worth exterminating the species? They're exterminated. They're not coming back. That's not an opinion or a conjecture. That's a fact. That's supported by 6 years of research expeditions. And the species to your left, I think, deserve a voice. They don't have a voice. Well, they do. It's me and you. I happen to be extremely vocal because they were my friends. I absolutely loved the coastline. I coveted the coastline. Anti-nuclear group to hold a celebration Olympia Sunday. This is an amazing story. An amazing story, really. I'll fix that. So these activists, for 40 years, since March the 5th, 1980, every year, or every Wednesday, for 40 years, rain and sleet and snow and brutal hot days have showed up to protest and to fight for your future. To fight for you to have a future free of fear. Bullies. Oops. It's called replay button. Forgot to turn it off. It's always something. I had the replay button on so I can do that right there. The disastrous downside of the Korea building nuclear weapons. Well, I just showed you the downside. The radioactive fallout is a downside, for starters. Although President Yoon walked back, and we'll get into that coming up. And again, my heart goes out, my hat goes off to those stoic activists that have stood the test of time. It takes an absurd amount of fortitude. It's just extremely inspiring, isn't it? Bless their hearts. Let's get into the news cycle for the last 24 hours. The disastrous downside of South Korea building nuclear weapons. North Korea was enslaved by Japan for 50 years, and then Japan left. The same year, United Nations showed up and bombed them into non-existence, and for 70 years have land, sea, and air embargoes strictly enforced, and collective punishment against the entire population of the country for 70 years. United Nations also has organizations known as UNICEF. So how can you have an organization to help the victims and be the same ones that created the victims? How does that actually work? How do you get the moral high ground? It's a very troubling question. So President Yoon was at the World Economic Forum in Davos, where current, past, and present leaders going and meeting in secret and announcing stuff like nuclear weapons at these types of meeting in foreign countries. Because the only people who run the planet are called UN. You have no planet. You have a kitchen, and that's what UN lets you have. One Marvel superhero is secretly preventing nuclear war at all times. He has the power to control the conscience of all leaders who have control over nuclear weapons. That's a comic book. So don't worry, kids. Your parents are not superheroes. Some fictional character we put in a comic book is your actual hero. It's pretty upsetting that people like that actually exist. A key member of the X-Men has prevented nuclear war for decades. See, a child that's reading a comic is going to believe that. But his true power could do much more. So how can a parent compete with a caricature of somebody's figment of imagination? A massive reversal of their stance towards humans, because the X-Men hate humans. The X-Men are behind the plot. Humans are bad, kids. That's your comic books. When comic books used to be innocent, now they're weaponized against the population. Influence a psychic block in any human who dares push the nuclear button. If one tries to bypass that, those who are trained to fire the missiles would similarly halt in their tracks. This is not a cartoon. This is brutal, vicious propaganda. Professor There's some good professors out there, I'm not saying that. There's an awful lot of bad ones, though. My goodness. How many did we cover over the last decade? 2,000 or something? That are terrible examples of a human? A professor alone has prevented nuclear war for decades, so the children grows up wanting to be professors. I got a niece right now, that's all she wants to do is grow up and be a professor. When she's grown up, she's gone to university with the intentions of being a professor. It's unfortunately so easy to get corrupted. It's almost impossible not to get corrupted. But she's a good and smart kid, so she can't be a professor. You have to be dysfunctional to get the job to be the teacher. Your job is to regurgitate what's in a book, not what's in your head. If the doomsday clock ever hits midnight, all the warmongers' hands would hover over the red button and find themselves incapable of pressing it. As one tries to buy, this is a comic book. So, the idea, I think, is to disassemble the family. Montana? Hello, Montana.
Hello, Durnford.
How are you, sir?
How are you, sir?
I'm good, thank you. You're live.
Hey, I was just,
You're aware of that, are you?
how am I coming through clearly?
You are so, actually, yeah.
Perfect. Hey, I'm just calling to make a plug for Ajali Shabazz, a.k.a. the Radical Sisters book, Furnace of Affliction.
Right, I know. I'm aware
Healing
of
radiation.
yeah.
You familiar with her book she wrote about?
Yeah, I'm familiar with her, yeah. She's still going strong.
She's still going strong.
She's still going strong, bless her heart, yeah.
Yeah, I just would like others to maybe consider purchasing the book and utilizing it for their
Yeah,
families.
they'll find her on YouTube at The Radical Sister. Is that correct?
Perfect. Maybe there's need little reminders, but I was intending to do here tonight.
Yeah, no, not an issue. No, we're very proud of her.
Recommendations about, she's got good recommendations about healing radiation damage to the human body is the subtitle. Furnace of Affliction. So
You got to admire people that try, right? And when
knowledge you have about how to make it through your damn grocery store these days without freaking yourself out, this might be useful for people. Chelation, the whole 9 yards.
Yeah, absolutely agree.
No guarantee we're inundated with it. So considering it's everywhere.
Oh, we're in
There's
trouble.
a way to kind of
We're in real
reduce your
trouble.
burden, I guess, best you can in the meantime.
Yeah, and it's a healthy way to think.
Yes, sir. Agree. Entirely. So that's what I called for.
Okay, good stuff.
Wish you a good evening.
Nothing else you want to add in there before you go? Okay, my friend.
That should do it.
Okay, thank you
Yeah,
very
just
much.
let you know that I'm pretty close to Kevin Blanche. He and I have done some road work over the years, and I'm sure people have been watching his posts lately, but he seems to be doing well. Fired up as usual and ready to roll. So
Oh, he's still got a long
keep on
recovery.
keeping on.
He's still got a long recovery, that's for sure.
No doubt.
Yeah, we're happy to see him moving around. No doubt about it. Okay, thank you.
Okay, man.
Have a nice
Appreciate
night
you, brother.
now.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, you're welcome. Take care now. Yeah, that's a book, The Radical Sister, and she's still quite active. And it's a struggle if you're anti-nuclear, as everybody knows. It's quite the struggle, in fact. And we like stuff like that a lot. It would be trivial for him to control the mind of multiple world leaders at once. So here you got caricatures of fictional imaginations brought to life in a fictional comic book that children a lot of times can't tell the difference, and strongly introduced into the most vulnerable of society with nonsense. With incredible nonsense to suggest anything like it, right? And so the nuclear industry has a huge influence in stuff like this, because they know the children are influenced. And this gets weaponized against the population as they get older. The brainwashing, that's just one page of a comic book, folks. Fordner, if Canada wants to go green, the CANDU reactors are disease factories. I'll break the protocol here and go. Just give me a second. I just redone on Saturday my go-to section, and I kept the old section too, and now I get confused. But not so much that I can't find the facts. Here we go. I'm starting to remember. I have two of them side by side, and that's creating a conflict for me. Let me get back on track. Here we go. No, right here. Okay, so Canada wants to go green. So, Tritium Hazard Report 2017. A tritium light factory for making lights. This is tritium 3H. The Peterborough Airport released 147 trillion becquerels of tritium to the atmosphere in just 5 minutes. It didn't become public knowledge till 2 years later. The limits for California is 20 becquerels a liter. The limits for Europe, most European reactors, was 15 becquerels a liter. Canada raised their limits to 44,000 becquerels a liter for the drinking water for millions of people in central Canada. But here's what they actually release in terabecquerels: a trillion. A terabecquerel is a trillion becquerels. So just to point Lepore nuclear reactor in Canada releases 16,400,000 liquid and vapor combined, so into the fresh water and into the air. 16,400,000 trillion becquerels. 16,400,000 trillion becquerels. That's just one of the CANDU reactors. The Gentili is 1.6 million trillion becquerels a year that they emit to. The Darlington, which is right in the center of Ontario, Toronto, is right alongside of it, with multiple millions of people. And so is Bruce Power and the Pickering Powers. And so UK's limit is 8 becquerels, or 8 trillion per year, rather. I got the other diagram there, but we'll just use this one only. So the limit for Canada's reactors is 34 million trillion becquerels per year. I forget, I've done the math on that recently, didn't we? A couple months ago. I think it was 10,000 pounds or something. Put it in context, like the Hiroshima bomb was, say, 15 pounds. Now, they're claiming that the tritium water, is such a low emitter10 nothing to worry about. But that's not true, because it permanently pulses energy every second for 120 years. It's got 10 half-lives of 12 years each, allegedly, right? But it's decaying to other fission products. Well, most isotopes. I can't remember tritium off the top of my head. I don't think it thinks it decays to the stable. But it's actually not a, even when it decays, say, to lead, it's still anthropogenic man-made lead, radioactive lead. It's such a low emitter, this says it has no adverse side effects, but they can't quantify those types of assertions. So, but 147 trillion becquerels from a light facility, and then you got Darlington and Pickerington and all the other Canadian CANDU reactors. So to suggest that if Canada wants to go green, the reactors is the way to go, is not dishonest, it's genocidal. There's other papers showing that pregnant women and children under the age of 4 shouldn't live within 10 miles of any of the CANDU reactors. And again, this is backed up by documentation, and even their own documentation makes these assertions. Now, the scary thing about the CANDU Canadian reactors, the Darlington, the Bruce, and the Pickering, the releases into the big Great Lakes, into the fresh waters, is right alongside of the intake for the cities with millions of people. So it's impossible for them not to be conflated, not to be connected. This is the Bruce Disease Factory in Ontario, Canada. That's what a CANDU reactor is, a disease factory. And they can't contain the tritium, see? They can't contain the bombardments. And the fuel pools are hemorrhaging into the fresh water too. The fuel pools are still splitting the atoms into the environment. Right? And so the same atoms you're splitting to boil water for millions of homes, those atoms that are doing that, and you put 2 million atoms in the head of a needle, but you can't see it. But one of those atoms is enough to cause up to 1,800, one of many 1,800 illnesses and diseases and autoimmune deficiencies and injuries. And everybody has the moral high ground to be concerned about this industry. So Joseph is basically a monster. He said, with the 25-year power generation build out in perspective, Canada would require 400,000 5-megawatt sized wind turbines, or 1,100 megawatt sized hydroelectric reservoirs similar in capacity to BC Hydro site, or 1,000 megawatt sized large nuclear reactors. Just 19 sites the size of Bruce Power in Ontario. Now, the thing is, the geothermal could replace all of them. Gas, oil, coal, and nuclear. You build your geothermal and shut off your gas, oil, coal, and nuclear. And he conveniently left that out. The reason they need so much wind is because they're not allowed to have storage. Last year, Canada had $4.3 billion allocated for storage, for renewables. Bruce Power took all $4.3 billion in Ontario, and at the same time, Ontario closed 700 renewable projects that were up and running and generating. So there was no competition. So Bruce Power got $4.3 million, and they're going to spend it on the hydro project instead of the renewable industry using it to create, there's around 20 different ways you can store electricity. Compressed air storage is one of my favorite. But see, geothermal doesn't exist when we talk about nuclear. And we know this because we've been at this for a very long time. Happily, they can do refurbishment, which is, they got the money. When Fukushima happened in Japan, the Canadian nuclear scumbag industry jacked $26 billion and threw it at the Bruce Power and the Darlington refurbishment, which is an absurd betrayal. But that's Canada. We lost a long time. 1970s, Canada was lost to the nuclear industry, captured by the degenerate nuclear industry, and their current inbreeding generations are in charge right now. He's currently enjoying life as a rancher in Alberta. And all you got to do is get out and promote disease, death, and destruction, and no future for the country, and he makes a lot of money. Savannah River Nuclear Solutions enter agreement with Payne College for internships. So, not Payne College, but schools of mass destruction. That's what they are. And Savannah River got nothing to be proud of. They got nothing to be proud of. Their legacy of pollutions to the aquifers is just, how is it even possible that they can get away with it? Has entered into a memorandum of understanding that they won't look at anything else, only dirty nuclear. And they go after the most vulnerable, the students in society. The average pantry of a 1950s era bomb shelter. The problem with the bomb shelter was the fear machine that was behind it, duck and cover. You remember all these connotations, I'm sure. The average pantry of a 1950s era bomb shelter. With some canned goods, and they say after 2 weeks you'll be okay, but you won't be okay after 2 weeks. And you need a bomb shelter around every nuclear power plant for at least 100 miles. And when the reactors are running, everybody should be in the bomb shelters. The reactors are hemorrhaging radiation into your environment from the fuel pools on capacity that the average person can't conceive. And I'm not kidding you, this is not a game. This is life and death of a planet we're looking at. Not from, and the nuclear weapons are bad, but it turns out the nuclear power plants are a disaster. They're hemorrhaging invisible plumes all day long. Civil defense all-purpose survival crackers. So the government had millions of these cans of crackers, 62 crackers per pound, and the crackers were infused with nutrition so you wouldn't get scurvy and stuff like that. But after 2 weeks, when you pick up enough radiation, your body can't uptake nutrition once you got so much radiation, because your body's not, right? Because like you get a lot of radiation, breathing it in, drinking it, getting showers and doing your laundry in it and everything else from the constant plumes. Your body is not producing the ranges of what red blood cells that you would normally produce. And for every red blood cell is carrying oxygen nutrition, the white blood cells you're creating they're going to displace the red blood cells. So as you get more radiation, your body attacks everything constantly with white blood cells, and there's no way to heal it, so it's permanent. So you're permanently displacing your red blood cells. NFS Emergency Response Plan request denied by Chancellor. This was an amazing story. I'm going to have to put it on the big screen. A lawsuit filed last year by Greene County environmental activist Park Overall seeking the release of documents detailing the emergency plan for nuclear fuel services. They were looking for the spill response and reporting, was denied last week by the Chancery Court judge in Davidson County. The basis for the denial outlined is the final memorandum and order filed January 10th by the Chancellor is a national security concern. So the mitigation is a national security concern. Wait for it. Officials earlier this year documents have been designated as confidential by the U.S. Department of Energy and are not open to the public inspection. They've been challenged. NFS produces reactor fuel for U.S. disease factory ships and commercial domestic operations. Also processes weapons-grade uranium into nuclear reactor fuel. That's mixed oxide fuel we're talking about. They're 28 miles upriver from Greensville, upriver in fresh water. It's one of two private facilities in the U.S. that is licensed to process highly enriched uranium. But what they're talking about is mixed oxide fuel, folks. Right? That was, never mind. The NRC designated the emergency plan emergency spill response procedure as official use only. So the community is not allowed to know what the emergency plan and emergency spill response procedures are going to be, so they can't recognize if it happened, what happened, right? U.S. Department of Energy designated the emergency plan is not publicly available, according to memorandums. Since such a plan and procedure surely are calculated to protect human life and safety, please explain how the disclosure could endanger anyone, Bullocks wrote, because they're being challenged, right? Because that's what's the idea, to protect people. But we can't tell you how we're going to protect you. We're just going to protect you, so don't worry about it. That's their response. Well, which is which means there's some major leaks. These are mixed oxide fuel facilities, production facilities. These are huge emitters. These are catastrophic emitters into your fresh water in your communities for at least 100 miles. If you do sex ratio studies, you're going to see more males than females. And the only way you can accomplish that is if everybody got equally radioactive pollution, which means up to 1,800 illnesses and diseases. While the petitioner contends that the state has not identified a person or group of people who could be endangered by the release of the document, so they're not saying, well, we can't release it because we're keeping it secret because we have people that are vulnerable, but you want to identify which group or people or entity or fable is vulnerable. So it's such a secretive industry, it has no right to exist, particularly in the capacity of being close to your communities. Now, we were supposed to cover this story last night. Could waste be left underground at the West Valley? Oh, when pigs fly, they can, Dana. When pigs fly. Well, guess what? The pigs are flying. An excavator deconstructs. It's not deconstructs. It's tearing down. Here, piggy. Oh, you know, that's an elephant, isn't it? When elephants can fly. I got my E's and P's wrong. I apologize. An excavator in the West Valley demonstration plant in Ashford, they're using special nozzles to keep the radiation from floating around. It's then collected and treated. Well, you can't treat radioactive water. And the site was only commercial U.S. nuclear fuel reprocessing plant when it operated in 1966 to 72. Well, it's not anymore. We just covered the story about another two places, right, that are private. It's absurd. Private disease factories. Many years after the site was abandoned by the Nuclear Fuel Service, the West Valley Demonstration Project, the demonstration project was, it's right along, they ran away and abandoned it. It was approved by Congress, signed into law by the President Jimmy Carter. Many milestones were met, such as solidifying 600,000 gallons of radioactive liquid waste. That's what they left there for 3 decades. Right by New York, evaporating into the environment, getting washed over with rain and snow into the environment. And preparing the main plant processing building for deconstruction, which is ongoing, is expected to take 30 months to take down this disease factory. And so there's no way to stop the emissions. They left, and you see the blue one, he's spraying with a special nozzle, he's spraying water. Expect to take 30 months. But what are the underground radioactive hazards? 2 very large steel tanks. With radioactive residue. When you hear the word residue, don't believe the word. That's because some of the liquids is evaporated into your communities. The residue, by the liter, if you took a liter of it and put it at a subway, everybody walked past it would die for 1 million years. Disposal areas that sit on a plateau above a waterway that enters into a major creek, which in turn flows to Lake Erie. They dumped reactor fuel into Lake Erie years ago, right? The plateau above Buttermilk Creek is no place for long-term storage of highly radioactive waste that ends up in Lake Erie when it rains. Phase 1, including the solidification of radioactive liquid waste in 275 steel containers, each 10 feet high, are stored on site in more than 50 concrete casks. They're vented. This stuff is still splitting atoms. It also includes the demolition of the main plant processing building to ground level, as well as intercepting 30 years later, an underground strontium-90 plume coming from the buildings. Well, it's already been flushing out for 30 years. So you're claiming it didn't make it anywhere and that you're going to intercept it. Now, it can't just be a strontium-90 plume coming from the building. Right, there's going to be all kinds of other fission and daughter products. It can't just be strontium-90. It's absurd to suggest it is, but there it is. They've just done that. What has been emerging over the last several meetings is citizens. Not academics, not scientists, not nuclear specialists. Citizens Task Force. There's been comments from state and federal officials regarding the possibility of leaving the steel tanks in place. Steel tanks in the ground with caustic chemicals inside of it. So the reason they're talking about that is because it already had a chain reaction and burnt the hole through the tank, and everything has already gone down into the ground. And that's one of the plumes they're alluding to, and excavating only parts of the underlined underground trenches, unlined. Well, you can't line it because it pulls up. And then you have a neutron bombardment and you got a chain reaction going on. So better just to poison everybody and have a chain reaction, Dana. Underground trenches filled with everything from medical waste to radioactive filters. Radioactive filters. Which was a requirement, but they didn't actually work, see? And a damaged fuel cell assembly. What are you talking about, a damaged fuel cell assembly? You're talking about a reactor core assembly that's damaged, and you what? You threw it in the trench? Well, how come they're not arrested and doing time in jail while we're cleaning it up? Sits on a plateau and is surrounded by creeks, which is not an accident. That's their oh shit plan, right? And on top of an aquifer is the number one rule when you're doing stuff like this. And the bigger the aquifer, the better. And all of them now, since the legacy 50s and 60s, all the national laboratories are absurdly radioactive. Some of the radioactive material remaining inside the 600,000 gallon tanks like cesium and strontium-90 with a half-life of 28 to 30 years. Like when you talk about neptunium-241 with a half-life of 1.3 days, 1 day, 3 hour half-life. It decays to plutonium-241 with a 24,000 year half-life. So when you talk about a half-life for 28 to 30 years, you're pretending it doesn't transform into other dangerous, long-lived fission radioactive isotopes that are harmful to everything with replicating cells. The material in one tank has been dried, while the other one still contains moisture. Well, it's not supposed to dry. It was put in wet. So then the sludge is left over is, you don't want to be walking past that place. It's in the ground because of the X-rays, gamma shines, and neutron bursts, right? Because now it's going into the ground instead of being at ground level, and everybody walking past it is getting bombarded. The same as Hanford. This is what they done Hanford tanks the same way. Oh, we got James Lucid calling in. Hang on, James. And James Lucid, people might know James from the comments section. Hi, James. How are you, sir?
I'm okay. I just wanted to kind of give you a little break for a minute. I want to let you know, like, I've been playing with AI a lot, and I've been asking it all these questions about Fukushima, nuclear energy in general, and I asked it to tell me a story about a homeless man who's been taken by the Japanese mafia to work at the Fukushima plant. And it came up with this story. And it's really quick. It's only going to be like a minute or two. I wanted to read this to you so you can catch your breath. I thought this would be a good intermission.
Go right ahead, James. Thank you.
So
I liked your 2 poems from last night, by the way.
So this is completely AI. This is not me generating this story at all. It's just me giving it a prompt like, hey, give me this story. Okay, this is how it starts. Once upon a time, there was a homeless man named Kinja who was wandering the streets of Japan. He had lost his job and his family due to a series of unfortunate events and had nowhere else to go. One day, while he was scavenging for food in the trash bin, he was approached by a group of men who claimed to be from a charity organization. They offered him a free lunch and a job opportunity as a laborer at the Fukushima nuclear power plant. Excited about the prospect of a meal and a chance to get back on his feet, Kinja accepted the offer without hesitation. He was taken to the plant and was told that he would be helping with the cleanup of the nuclear disaster that had occurred there several years ago. He was given a suit and a mask to wear, and he was put to work alongside other laborers. However, Kinja soon realized that he had been lied to. The job was not as easy as he had been led to believe, and the working conditions were far from safe. The radiation levels were incredibly high, and he was not given proper protection. He was also not given a proper meal, and he was given food that was not fresh. He was malnourished, and he was often sick. Despite his complaints, the Japanese mafia who hired him ignored him, and he was forced to continue working at the plant. He was exposed to high levels of radiation, and over time he began to develop symptoms of radiation sickness. He was diagnosed with cancer, and his health rapidly deteriorated. Once he was no longer able to work, he was discarded by the Japanese mafia and left him to die alone. He was left with no compensation, no support, and no one to care for him. Kinja died alone and in poverty. His sacrifice for the cleanup of the nuclear disaster was not acknowledged. He was just another forgotten victim of the Fukushima disaster.
Wow.
Isn't that crazy?
That's wonderful. Well, it's not wonderful, but as for a story, that's pretty accurate, I must say. Because that's the true story, actually.
It's just like, it just generated that. I was stunned. I'm like,
that's a bit uncomfortable.
Wow.
Maybe,
Yeah.
Like AI is not supposed to be accurate, I don't think, right? Per se, like that kind of accuracy. That's crazy.
Well, I think if you approach it with...
The nuclear industry is going to fix that. They're not going to put up with that.
If they try, it's going to take a lot of money to fix that, I bet. But yeah, I just think it's interesting. But I just wanted to share that, Dana. Thank you so much for the show tonight.
Yeah, you're welcome, James. That's great. I appreciate the 2 poems from last night, too. That was pretty good stuff. I copied them. I might use them later. Yeah. Thank you, James.
Definitely. All right. Take care. All right. Bye.
Yeah. Bye-bye. That's an amazing story right there. Well, my job is finished. AI just put me out of business. AI just got at me. Well, so here's a real report. Send us people who don't mind dying.
Another example, immediately after the first hydrogen explosion, TEPCO gave out an order a request to all of these labor dispatching companies, and they said, send us people who don't mind dying. At that time, it was really very much a panic situation, perhaps, but normally when you enter any area where there might be possible radiation exposure, you're always supposed to be issued a special
get sick and die badge. Send us people who don't mind dying. When you look at the nuclear industry's legacy, and it doesn't terrify you, doesn't mortify you, let me just go through some of that, because James has really struck up on something super important. Help Wanted ad seeks employees able to carry out a conversation. Does that sound like that AI story very much to you folks? Seniors sought for frontline radiation cleanup. People who worked all their life are considered disposable. Fukushima is the same as the war. Concerned workers on site do not consent to join the battle. People held hostages. Fukushima governor, Tokyo governor, vice governor suggested a Fukushima draft. All of Japan must face your broken power plant. That's one major reason you don't want to have a nuclear power plant anywhere in your countries. Fukushima worker wanted to escape from the plant but feared he might hurt me. At parties, we were forced to eat radioactive mushrooms, which is the worst for bioaccumulation, and bee larvae gathered from inside the evacuation zone. He called my mother to tell her I was in trouble, these are very vulnerable people, see? Top Tokyo doctor dealing with nuclear workers demand government step in at Fukushima plant for safety reasons. Some are unable to read. It sounds like a nuclear scientist to me, actually. Fukushima worker filmed at the plant that was asked to fake the documents. Underage people are employed. Guardian on Fukushima workers. We felt like kamikaze pilots, acute radiation sickness, ever-present danger. There's parts of the site they still don't have full control of today. Fukushima decontamination workers threatened we were punished. Can you imagine nuclear scientists saying we were punished if we tried to exist? I learned over 800 people disappeared from the Fukushima plant, killed or died during work. They were killed by fuel rods which were injected all over the site. They would send the homeless, hey, go over there and stand up. I want to get a picture taken, and they would drop dead. Fukushima 311 tape, it's time to make a geezer, which is an absurd slurred, by the way, suicide squad. Not nuclear scientists. No Fukushima 50, that's the Fukushima 50, was the victims of society. Some people not given any food. We can only work momentarily. You're not working, you're the homeless. You don't have the qualifications to work in that environment with a paper suit on. Concerned half of Japan to be covered in nuclear waste. 16-year-olds should be prepared to die at the Fukushima disease factory. Fire out of control at reactor 4. Out of control. You're out of control. Forbes. They're outrageous. Forbes even called it, Forbes is just degenerate. Forbes even called it outrageous, which boggles my mind. Homeless people are being sold to companies and put to work on Fukushima radiation. Can you imagine some kid, Mom, Daddy's nuclear scientists are being sold to companies and put to work on Fukushima? I seen it in the comic book. Homeless are taken to work at Fukushima ready to die. At the end of the month, they're left with no money. They end up in debt for shelter and food. They're robbed of their dignity and humanity. The mentally handicapped are working at Fukushima, often given worse paper suits than the regular victims. Second-hand paper suits. The mentally disabled are working at Fukushima. The homeless are treated like disposable people. Yeah, that's the nuclear industry. They don't have a human among them. TEPCO raises the safe radiation exposure limit to 500 times the original level from 180 counts per minute. And when was the last time you seen my Geiger counter not go way above 180 counts per minute? Often reported as 2.5-fold increase. Workers are tricked to being on the front line. They kept me in the shed. There's nowhere to go. And after a few days, they throw you away. And, in 1957, when Windscale melted down, in 57, the rich people sat in the front row of the theaters. People were taken from the movie theaters and forced to go into Windscale to push the burning fuel rods out of the graphite reactor. They didn't go to other nuclear power plants to get volunteers. They didn't go to the nuclear colleges and universities, to Oxford or anywhere else looking for volunteers. They went to the theaters and took the most vulnerable of society who were in the back rows. I made the police. Let me start that again. I put together this bunch of graphics, and the documentary, I screen captured, and I stuck that up on the screen.
the police from the factory had turned up looking for volunteers, and they'd brought a bus, and they decided the best way to get the volunteers was to go to the cinema and volunteer the back 2 rows at the show to go into the factory to, as it turned out, to help push the fuel rods out of the reactor.
So they kidnapped people from the back rows of the theater instead of getting volunteers from other nuclear power plants, or the military, or police, or firefighters, or the heralds were the impoverished who were in the back of the theaters in the 1950s. So the water that's supposed to be in the tanks at 2.2 sieverts per hour just beta. Magically, there's no gammas, alphas, or neutrons, or X-rays per single liter. So what that means is that you filled up one of those tanks, which would be 1.4 million sieverts of just beta, because apparently gamma, alphas, and neutrons don't exist in Japan. You couldn't build another nuclear disease or another tank. You would need all the other tanks full of natural water to shield you from a single tank at 2.2 sieverts per liter. But it can't be just 2.2 sieverts per liter because they only acknowledge beta. Which means, like, because when you're talking about that, when you got that high of these 3 sieverts is a lethal dose to a human, right? You'll die within a couple of weeks from very short exposure to that, walking past it. So if you put in gammas, alphas, neutrons, that water will vibrate. It'll physically vibrate because they don't mix. When they pulse energy, they reflect off each other at almost the speed of light. Suffolk's delight is sizable sea court hearing confirmed. It's another great story from more wonderful activists in the United Kingdom that are pursuing the closure or the discontinuing of Sizewell C. That it's only got about $1 billion allocated to it. The money hasn't showed up, right? And so what they're planning on doing is fighting them in court, saying, first off, there's no water, fresh water for these facilities. The plant has countered by saying, well, we'll filter the water from the ocean, which means you're going to kill all kinds of species to do that, by the way. Because typically a glass of salt water had 1 billion creatures in it. A glass. Just a normal glass would have 1 billion creatures. And 75 to 100 million of them were the phytoplankton, the basis of the food chain, the basis of the oxygen chain, the basis of the carbon sequestering chain. They were annihilated from Fukushima, but also from all legacy weapons dumping. A $25 billion project, well, even if they build this facility, there's zero possibility they're going to build it at 25 billion sterlings. Zero. It's going to be at least 35 to 45 billion. The High Court will hear arguments against the $25 billion project by a group including Together Against Sizewell C and Stop Sizewell C on Wednesday, March the 22nd and Thursday, March the 23rd. I'm really looking forward to that. I emailed them and asked them to consider these places are surrounded by farms in their applications. And just to make them aware, because you get conditions. You see these pictures all the time, and this is not a gas plant or oil plant or coal. You only see this with nuclear. The reason it is because nuclear is always hemorrhaging radiation from the fuel pools. This is why I call them disease factors, because that's exactly what they are. And every time it rains, it washes it down to the coastline, where it evaporates and becomes radioactive clouds. You get tens of thousands of miles of clouds every day from the ocean. But it's also liberated back into the communities through crashing of the coastline. You liberate the plutonium, uranium, and the communities are getting brutal doses. They can replace it with geothermal. There's a company out there planning on replacing gas, oil, and coal plants with geothermal since June 2022. But in the last couple of months, nuclear have seen it, and we're freaking out. Well, we can do it. their small modular reactors can do it, but they don't actually exist, right? Your small modular reactors can't do anything because, they don't exist. And you got to get a prototype. So you're going to put all this energy into fusion, all this energy in small modular reactors. When you have geothermal at your fingertip, if you took the same people, the same monetary, and applied that, everybody could have geothermal. The Holy Grail is just a drill that'll drill deep enough no matter where you took. For most of the world, we have access to it already. Just got to dig down. No more gas, oil, and coal. And the emissions is water, like hydrogen would be, right? But so this is better. Hydrogen's good for mobility, right? For ships and planes and helicopters and cars and homes and everything else, certainly. But geothermal is a base load energy. It's good for 1 million years. And as your plant gets more older, you can just build a new one alongside of it, take your time, and when it's finally ready to turn off the other one, you turn it off and switch on your new one. No, there's no deep geological repositories, no constant emissions into the environment. UN nuke chief, Rafael Grossi, who probably shouldn't exist, right? Ensures Fukushima water release plant follows safety standards. Well, that's simply not true. First off, it's all homeless and the destitute and the victims of society, immigrants who don't even speak the language that are there, not UN. Second off, I showed you at the beginning of the show my research expeditions, and so they killed the ocean. Now, I also produced 2 very detailed presentations in the last couple of weeks at my site here on the tanks, Japan tanks. You'll find them easily if you look. But I also got playlists of the last year of producing multiple presentations on the tanks. And I'll just give you a short version of some of the key points that you need to take away from that, because these videos are fairly long. Okay, they're long. But that's because it's full of details, right? So the tanks, there's a few facets to the tanks. The first one and the second one. Here's the second one, or here's the first one, is the filtration system. So the REVA system, there was also the series system, SARRY, which was for the cesium-137, right? Because that's the Fable. That didn't work because it's a Fable, see? And you can't change your filter once you run it. So for the last 3 years, the REVA, the French system, which is similar to the fabled ELP system, August the 12th, 2014, has been kept out of operation for 3 years. The REVA system, or the ELP system, has yet to function reliably 2014. They built all the tanks in the first 3 years. In 2014, TEPCO says bypass operations not having any effect at Fukushima. 2013, they failed to deliver on a promise to build an offense to restrict the radioactive materials from flowing into the Pacific, which was a complete fable because they failed because it can't be done. So instead of building a real wall, they allegedly built an ice wall and hired 260,000 people to do it. But when you look at the amount of money they had, you divide it by 260,000 employees they claimed they had, then everybody made $1,200 if you don't buy anything. And they also admit that the wall won't stop the groundwater. There's no bottom in it. And why would you use an ice wall when you can use a real wall? Okay. Back here. So then the tanks themselves, let me touch on that right quick before we move. I think that's important that we touch on stuff like that. Okay, so 2013, they had 8,000 tanks. You know how many tanks they got today? 2023, 1,000 tanks. 2014, they had 1,200 large industrial tanks. 2017, according to the Australia and many other medias, they had 900 tanks. And try walking with both of your heels on the ground. See how that works out for you. In 2019, they had 1,000 tanks. The fourth line from the bottom, you see 1,000 tanks. In 2021, April 10, 2021, Associated Press, they only had 1,000 tanks. So they built all their tanks in 2013. Now they're claiming that everything is in tanks. The International Atomic Energy Agency is not a watchdog. If you go read their site, their job is promote nuclear energy. And who are the International Atomic Energy Agency? They're part of the military-industrial complex known as UN, which is 195 militaries. So why give them any credibility when they don't deserve any? When you look at what they've done in North Korea for 70 years, why would you put any trust in an organization with those attributes? North Korea hasn't attacked anybody in 70 years. How many people has Britain, United States, and UN sanctioned and attacked? It's endless, right? Fukushima Water released to follow safety rules was another headline today. Now, I produced two presentations, total of about 5 hours in just the last couple of weeks, only on the tanks. And if you watch either one of them, you realize we killed the oceans. And I provide the documentation. It's unassailable. And this kind of work, is taking me forever. And so last year they took down my other YouTube channel with 1,300 presentations on it. And all my research expeditions. For no reason. There was no emails, there was no strikes, there was no restrictions. I was out looking for spiders, and we were reporting live from ground zero that the spiders were missing from the forest. And came across another researcher who works with 13 people in Nova Scotia who told me the same story. And I had reported that, and when I woke up the next morning to post another update, because I had moved about 50 miles further, my site was gone with 24,200 subscribers. And I had those 24,200 exactly subscribers for 4 years. I never gained one, I never lost one. But we were able to keep the operation moving, right, because we had enough support. So then I had to start up this new channel I got now, and I now have 1,000 plus subscribers. It's very difficult now to fund this operation anymore. And now the whole operation is breaking down, falling apart on me. But lucky for me, I have the ability not to give up no matter what. Quit is not in the dialogue. It's not in my genetics to give up. So Fukushima to release contaminated water, an expert explains why this could be the best option. The so-called expert, who we've covered before, I might add, the University of Portsmouth was paid a total of $25,000 for Jim Smith's consultant for a range of clients, including Horizon Nuclear Power and the Japan's Atomic Energy Agency. The Japan Atomic Energy Agency was created the year after Fukushima. They're not really an agency at all. They're an agent, all right, but they're not an agency. So the professor of environmental science, who was pro-story, in 2012-2017, he was awarded as a grant from the UK Natural Environmental Research Council, partly funded by the Radioactive Waste Management, on research at Chernobyl, of all places. It's absurd. Their job is to cover it up. Now, we covered this scumbag a number of times. After the actual large amounts of radioactive contamination into the ocean to the imposition of a marine exclusion zone, huge reputational damage. Reputational damage? Are you suggesting it's not warranted? Are you implying there was no... I mean, that's such a... Why be so evil? Obviously, with an education like yours, you can get a real job. So why take a job to be a scumbag? Because that's the nature of the beast. Huge volumes of contaminated water accumulate at the site. No, you can't contain the water. And I got 2 presentations done in the last 2 weeks available on my site and playlist. I can guarantee if you watch that stuff, you'll understand the urgency that I have. This is not a game. That's the gallows laugh, by the way. Water is needed to cool the damaged. They're not damaged, they're completely destroyed. Calling them damaged is completely dishonest. Here's a picture. Some pictures tell you 1,000 words. These tell you 500,000 words. These buildings are never going to be functional again. They lost the entire inventories, which is 4 decades of reactor cores. Losing 4 decades of reactor cores is not a game. At least I hope it's not. Bear with me. Bear with me. Technical difficulties. I always feel like somebody's watching you from behind. You only got a little bit of time left to sort it all out. You ever have that feeling?
Hey pal, you just blowing from Stupid Town?
Could be. Not saying I'm not. The site is running out of storage space and the tanks could leak, particularly in the event of an earthquake. Got any idea how many earthquakes they had right off that coastline? Last year on the 16th of March, they'd done $5 billion worth of damage across Japan with an earthquake right off the coastline. Who are these people interfering in my show? Get out of here, you bloody robots! Stop goofing around. Oh, that's my little pet robot. He's always a goofy little guy. Look at him. Problem is, he eats all the crackers and he makes weird... This is the nuclear industry. He makes incredibly dangerous concoctions that exterminate eventually all the species on the planet. As an environmental scientist, says Scumbag, I have worked on the impacts of radioactive pollutants in the environment for 30 years. You have covered up radioactive pollutants in the environment for more than 30 years is more like it. He said, I think releasing the wastewater, calling it wastewater. So he's a professor with a room full of students each year that are going to turn out to be monsters. There's no other outcome when you've got a professor with this kind of... Like, people like this should be arrested and should serve federal time, at least, for crimes against humanity. And this person should be arrested for crimes against humanity. He said before it's stored, it's treated. You can't, as I showed you earlier, the system... see, the problem with the filtration system, when you're putting 2 sieverts a liter through that, within a few minutes you got to run away. You can never get back in the building or change the filter. So after about 20 minutes, the filter is 1,000 sieverts. So any water that's running through it at 2 sieverts, you're going to come out the other end at 5 or 10 or 15 per liter. And this was the problem with all the systems. But it wasn't about a system, it was about a cover story. Right? And so if the tanks were actually filling them up with radioactive material, they're claiming one of their other crazy, kooky stories is that they're sucking the water out of the bottom of the reactor building, which is a complete lie. The water was originally coming from wells dug around the site, test wells. And it was so high they couldn't get rid of it, and so they were going to put it in tanks and then filter it. That was the fable story. Until 2015 when it changed. So in 2015, the official story was they were taking water from the reactor after spraying it, which is quite the trick. Then they're sucking it up and putting it through the ELP system, and the water that's coming out, half of it goes into a tank, which they said was 150 tons a day, which is equal to a garden hose, right? Over 24 hours, by the way. It's your average everyday household tap is 130 to 150 tons a day. And so the other half, they said, they're worth 300 tons a day. 150 tons was going into the tanks. 150 other tons was being sprayed back on the reactor, which is burning at 9,000 degree Fahrenheit temperatures. So no matter what falls down on it or gets sprayed on is atomized and aerosol and ionized and radiated and released as an invisible plume that you can't perceive it, you can't see it, you can't smell it or taste it or hear it or feel it or touch it or pick it up. It's like it doesn't exist. But it's so dangerous that a single atom can trigger multiple immune responses, autoimmune illnesses. Your immune system doesn't have a trigger to protect you from it. And so it festers for maybe a decade or two. And it's under a siege the whole time with white blood cells and eventually builds a tumor around it. But if in an event like this where you're being bombarded with shocking plumes we've seen in Canada in studies at 20 million particles of iodine-129 per liter, or 131 per liter, and 220 million atoms of iodine-129 per liter, which means all the thyroid glands of all the species, humans included, were saturated, sustained, which also means that you're producing radioactive hormones on a whole different level. 180 was typically an evacuation zone. What is 220 million then? Right, so divide 180 into 220 million, and that's how many times above the evacuation zone Canada was. And because you can't, like my Geiger counter won't pick it up, right? The World Health Organization, which is not the World Health Organization, this is United Nations. This is another subsidy of the IAEA and IRPA and ONSCLEAR and the IPCC and ICPR and IPRC and they got all kinds of subsidy companies. But they don't rule. Why are they ruling the planet? Why are they setting the standards for every human on the planet? How the hell did we get this stupid that a organization that is 195 militaries is dictating every facet of our life like an alien invasion, right? Because that's what they're acting like. We're talking about madness times infinity. So they're saying that the World Health Organization's drinking water standards for tritium is 1,000 becquerels per liter. A 1,000 becquerels per liter. Now he's claiming that it doesn't bioaccumulate, but it does, because it's water and your body is mostly made up of water. So bear with me. Let me explain bioaccumulation. To suggest that only tritium is left over is dishonest. Let's just use that word because everything else is probably illegal for me to say. But let me explain to you the bioaccumulation, why that's so important. Well, every facet of it's important, obviously, right? So it can get confusion, but I'll walk you through it. So the water becomes radioactive. Then the producers at 1,000 becquerels, which is the phytoplankton, into the zooplankton is 10,000 becquerels. per magnification. Then you got the small fish at 100,000. And of course, shellfish bioaccumulated 125,000% more than a fish do. Then you got large fish at 1 million becquerels because they're eating all the bioaccumulation as it goes up the food chain. And then birds and humans and other species, up the top of the food chain is doing this bioaccumulation. And it works like this. 500 days of 10 becquerels per day, which seems pretty harmless. At 500 days, you're going to look at 1,400 man-made anthropogenic becquerels, atoms in your body, pulsing energy every second, almost at the speed of light. Now, this is still horrific numbers, but it's not nowhere close to the real numbers. So 1,400 becquerels for 70 kilogram adults equals 20 becquerels a kilogram. For a 20 kilogram child, you're 70 becquerels a kilogram. These are catastrophic numbers because your immune system has to respond to every one of these, right? But we're only acknowledging a fraction of what the actual real numbers are. And so there's 1,800 diseases and illnesses and autoimmune deficiencies and injuries, suggesting that tritium is the only thing coming out of the site. And if you go to, Tank's presentations, you'll see these numbers. Maybe I'll just take them up for you. It sounds like a huge number. Globally, 57 petabecquerels of tritium is produced naturally in our atmosphere by cosmic rays. By 1950, we produced more tritium into the oceans than a million years of it. By 1960, we had hundreds of times above the natural emissions. But man-made tritium, 3H, is different than the natural tritium, 3H. We call it man-made because the sun doesn't produce it. The atmosphere doesn't produce it. And so everything on the planet has no autoimmune defense against it. Everything with replicating cells is vulnerable to it. The radiation dose to people is not sieverts. That's for like energy. That's like X-rays or something. So everything else you measure in physical atoms, physical decays, becquerels, pulsing energy, but from a physical atom, not from fuel rods. So the fuel rods will be measured in sieverts, or millionth of a sievert, microsievert. This is how they confuse you when they talk about microsieverts and sieverts. You're not going to get microsieverts or sievert doses 5,000 miles away. You're going to be breathing in physical atoms. They're going to sequester in your muscles, your organs, and your bones. Your body's going to attack the physical atoms relentlessly with white blood cells. It's going to displace your red blood cells for the rest of your life. And so you become lethargic, and you start compromising your immune system with the bioaccumulation. And now you're more susceptible to pathogens and viruses and illnesses and diseases that were normally innocuous and benign and harmless. The maximum estimated dose from Fukushima discharged water would be 8.9 microsieverts per year. It's lower than the 2,400 fake microsieverts people receive from natural radiation. You can't conflate natural and man-made radiation. And the people like that should be put in a dungeon for the rest of their lives, and in particular that professor, because he's teaching students this pure propaganda from the nuclear industry at your local universities. They've captured all of them, see? He's not the only one, but he's one of the worst ones. We've covered Schmidt quite a few times. On the grand scale of the environmental problem, the release of the wastewater from Fukushima is a relatively minor one, but it's likely to be more reputational damage to the nuclear wasteland. Fukushima, where they picked up 30 million one-ton bags. I suppose that's imaginary too, is it, Schmidt? I disrespect you, sir, for doing that. Shame on you. Your parents should be charged for not reporting you for being a monster when you were young. More reputational damage. What a disgusting, despicable, revolting thing to write, that whole story. What a complete dishonest person he is. He's completely dishonest from his toes to the top of his head. He's a completely dishonest, and which means he's a very dangerous person. So one only wonders how many of the female students did he molest or rape? Because you can be sure that's exactly what that personality is doing all the time. Fukushima brewers use AI to develop sake to pair up with different fish species. Remember James called in recently with a story about created by artificial intelligence. He put the inputs in there and it wrote this amazing, accurate story. So now they're using AI to develop sake. So they're using artificial intelligence. They put in a type of fish, and the artificial intelligence tells them what kind of sake they need to pair up with it. So apparently you can't drink fish, or you can't eat fish without getting drunk in Japan. And now the place where the sake is coming from is Nami. Nami is a nuclear wasteland. They abandoned Nami for 7 years, and they should have never went back. Most didn't. I got a huge folder in Nami somewhere. Let me see if I can find it. And this one of the pictures of Nami. It's an abandoned town, right? Has created sake that matches different fish species cut off the coast of the prefecture by using artificial intelligence. Now, he even talks about how he wants to protect the reputation, the safety of local marine products. You can't have safety. The reactor's still melting down, sir. You acknowledge your country's radioactive because you picked up 30 million one-ton bags. Not only that, I've done presentations on the radioactive fallout across the entire country. And just the year in Tokyo was 270 times more gamma than it was during nuclear weapon war. They call it nuclear testing. It's a nuclear war. It's the same bombs with the same radioactive fallout. Doesn't need to be in anger to have radioactive fallout. The big idea, bring back nuclear power. Unfortunately, there's no shortage. There's no shortage of scum. Well, it destroys your DNA permanently. This is permanently. It destroys your heart. And we see absurd amount of people dying from heart attacks. We see studies after Fukushima of 20,000 people in America in just a short period of excess people with heart attack. It caused absurd amount of respiratory lung diseases. The plutonium burns a hole through the lung and sequesters in the bones of children, for instance, and then mutates their stem cells as they're growing up. And so they grow up emaciated because their body can't uptake nutrition no more. Because they're producing so much white blood cells, they got leukemia. You can get that from eating food from your local supermarkets because Japan, particularly in Canada, is importing it. Canada lifted all restrictions, not that it had any, after 93 days. 55 countries banned the food in Japan in 14 prefectures, not just Fukushima. So to suggest Fukushima is unfounded reputational damage is and then we know we're going to see a lot of that because there's a big push from the Japan government this year, right, to, like Uchibori faking being in America, in Washington and Los Angeles, and all the pictures only show Japan in the background. And no American media have reported on his so-called food fear that he's bringing around America. It's a total fable that he was there. David Novog is the director of the Institute for Energy Studies and a professor of engineering physics at McMaster University. Oh crap, that's Canada. I apologize to everybody because this is a Canadian story. The Canadian nuclear industry are actual real-life scum, right? Renewables like hydro, wind, and solar are great, but we shouldn't forget the reliable, low-emission standby that is nuclear power. It's not low emissions. Every nuclear power plant needs 2 external power supplies. How is that low emissions, scumbags? You're using the most resource-intensive industry on top of that, and your fuel pools are hemorrhaging radiation 24/7. Decades after you shut down the last reactor on top of that. You can't stop it. Those emissions are going into the local communities, into the biosphere, looking for victims for millions of years until they finally find ones. There's no path to net zero, which was a paper by Miles Allen, and it was just a theory. And the United Nations snatched it along with James Hansen and Brock, I can't remember his name, climate change paper, and BP Oil, the carbon footprint, which was a public relation firm to blame you for their troubles. And it worked. And the United Nations proliferated that into 195 countries immediately, and it ricocheted off into the rest of the planet. They're just horrific scum every time we look. There's no path to net zero by 2050 without nuclear. Of course there is. It's absurd to suggest there's not. He said as a teenager, when he wasn't out raping children, long before anyone cared about the climate change, I did a science project to show the tremendous amount of power could be produced from just a tiny amount of uranium. Really, you think you're unique or something? But the problem was you can only harvest 2% of it. Doesn't matter how much power is there if you can't get access to it. And that the waste left over is splitting atoms into the environment, poisoning the universe forever and ever. Long past the human experience, that radiation will still be ricocheting around the planet, killing species. The science remains the same. An atom-splitting process, known as nuclear fission, generates a huge amount of heat. Well, the heat is generated from hundreds of terabecquerels per liter to boil the water, right, of atoms. And once it comes out of the reactor and goes into the fuel pool, it's hemorrhaging them into the environment forever. And every year you're adding more to the pool. So every year there's a bigger bioaccumulation. Every year there's more. It never goes away. And you're releasing more every day, all day, every year. The modular part means that the small modular reactors can be made in factories and transported by trucks, trains, or barges. Yeah, but they don't exist, so that you don't know if that's true. You can't quantify that assertion because you can't prove that that's true. Like Rolls-Royce is saying they're going to build small modular reactors. The only problem is they're around 500 megawatts. They're not small. They're not modular. They're huge reactor facilities. The cores of many small modular reactors aren't much bigger than the average office desk. Well, you can't quantify that assertion either because you don't have one. And a reactor core the size of an office desk will kill everybody on the planet that walks past it. And every species that walks past it for millions of years. Canada's carbon footprint, which was BP Oil. BP Oil had a large campaign to blame you. And he said, look at your carbon footprint. You're the reason that our oil ships ran on the rocks and polluted the coastline because you needed the oil. And who's you? Well, besides the military. To do so, we need to double or triple our electricity generations in the next 20, 30 years. Geothermal is perfect. Right now, we don't have the ability to swiftly double Canada's hydro capacity. Yeah, we do. It's called geothermal. And he said that's where small modular reactors come in. Again, you got another professor at another university cutting your throat. And it's so rare to get it. It's 1 in 1,000 professors that won't cut your throat. Because we cover this each day, right? What's wrong with geothermal? There's a company that's doing it, Quasi Electrics, is saying we can replace all gas, oil, and coal plants with this technology because it's obsolete technology, and we come up with a system that allows us to dig down no matter how deep it is. Well, because the industry is vampires. That's who they hire. They hire real-life monsters that are predatory on humans. They're not there to... The professor's not there to help humans. They're there to prey upon them, to teach the children to be predators too. That's their job, see? And you can't deny that. Yeah, there's some good professors out there, but they're unfortunately overshadowed by the absurd amount of evil. And when I say absurd amount, I mean all of the academics that we come across have turned their souls against humanity in the worst possible way, and the 8 million species that we're the stewards of, by the way, I might add. Right now, we don't have the ability to swiftly double Canada's hydro capacity. Well, there's more renewable than hydro, man. Like geothermal is perfect. There's all kinds, there's 20 different storage solutions. Like compressed air storage. If you took the money that you're wasting on stupid fusion and idiotic small modular reactors that don't exist, and put these tens of thousands of scientists to work on storage and geothermal, we'd be well done in 5 or 10 years' time, wouldn't we? It's not like we can't do it, it's we won't do it because the nuclear industry has captured all your media, your regulatory agencies, your universities, and key positions, if not all of them, in your governments in increments over 8 decades. The minute you control the universities is the minute you can put the pro scum in the key positions, because the industry is going to ask you who's the bright student that we're going to hire this year. And they're going to say, well, that guy there, because he's pro-nuclear. He was trained by Jim Smith, or da-da-da, or D-D-D. So to put up for McMaster's to come out with this story that is completely dishonest, and these recommendations for nuclear waste disposal regulation and partnerships with indigenous communities. What about the rest of the communities? Because the indigenous communities is where you're going to put all the waste. That's your legacy, right? Just ask the Navajo, amongst all the rest of them. And suggest that the emissions of the small modular reactors, a figure equivalent to the emissions of nearly 160,000 gas cars, could be saved. Well, what about the world's 15 biggest ships create more pollution than the 760 million cars on the planet? If you're really worried about the emissions, why aren't you worried about that? Why aren't you yelling about that? Why aren't you concerned about that, sir? Well, I call you sir, but I'm not being honest. You're a scumbag. The big idea, bring back nuclear power. So what we're seeing is this consistent and desperate narrative, right? This is a panic. They're panicking. We're seeing that symmetrically throughout the nuclear industry. Right? There's 90,000 of these ships on the ocean at any given time, which is equal to over 4 trillion people a day on the planet in automotive when you scale it up, right? But what about geothermal? Why isn't it that the go-to? Because that should be if you're talking about renewable, it should be geothermal then tidal. Both of them don't need storage. Then it should be wind and solar combined with storage. But not first. First it should be geothermal and tidal energy. Guaranteed and predictable for thousands of years. Or is it more fun to pretend? Well, this is what we see with the industry. This is the nuclear industry. That's what it does. It's a little devil, and it's, a genie is going to come by and fix everything. And if the genie can't fix it, don't worry, we got robots can fix it. And they don't got any. Or Spider-Man, or the Hulk, or whatever other fable they can roll out. That's the industry for you. It's broken. And it wants to take you with them. So the first thing we need to do if we want to save the planet, we got to get rid of all professors and replace them with people that are not scumbags. No miracle needed. There's a professor that's almost, right? Almost a good guy. Not quite, but he's almost a good guy. Professor Mark Jacobson on how wind, solar, and water can power the world. 95% of the world can be powered, and so it's easy to fill in the gap. Combustion is the problem. You're continuing to burn something that's not solving the problem. Well, the problem is radioactive fallout. Radioactive fallout is your problem. Oh, I don't know. Hang on. So, there's a lot of these models from different institutions after Fukushima. Here's another model. Fukushima radioactive fallout is global warming. So you got 20-day or 19.5-day, 468 hours plume from Fukushima covering the planet. There's an invisible plume. It's the same as the snowstorm. So imagine a snowstorm covers the planet in 19.5 days, and it pulses energy every second. But you can't see it. It's the same thing as a snowstorm, but you can't see it. And it's pulsing energy every second, almost at the speed of light, almost at 300,000 kilometers an hour, 186,000 miles, or 300,000 kilometers a second, 186,000 miles per hour a second, just shy of the speed of light. Because that's what gammas, alphas, neutrons, betas, and x-rays are doing. But they don't mix. When they hit each other, they change directions, a braking effect. It's a German word, I think, is a Bremsenlung. And it's a well-known effect, by the way. It's not some rare secret. And this creates an X-ray. So the species in the forest and the humans are getting full-body X-rays from this invisible plume that you can't perceive. That exists, that is actually real. And so that's global warming. It's been going on for 80 years, and this model is only based on a short venting. It's not based on the actual meltdowns or the detonations or the loss or any of the inventories in a single reactor, let alone all of them. So this is the camel that broke the planet's back, for sure. And this is why I've done those research expeditions that I showed you at the beginning. They're extremely important. If you didn't see them, watch them after. New nuclear and other technologies are expensive, waste of time. Way to go! Woohoo! Finally! Finally somebody. So he mentions geothermal, but he also mentions batteries. And that's okay, but I despise batteries because there's so many better solutions. Incredible solutions that are available. And many that we haven't even discovered ourselves. But there's around 20 storage solutions that are applicable. And geothermal doesn't need batteries or storage on top of that. And geothermal should be the first and foremost. Why wouldn't it be? You dig down, tap into 1,000-degree Fahrenheit temperatures, and that's it. Just pump the water through. It's done that by its own power, unlike a nuclear power plant, which needs 2 external power supplies. The missing 5% is for long-distance aircraft and ships. And so hydrogen-powered fuel cells can be developed. We have 95% of the technology right now that we need to solve the problem. And geothermal will solve all of it. It's the best by far. It's just like a building on the landscape instead of the great big windmills are great, but why wouldn't you do geothermal first and use windmills to supplement it, or solar, or whatever? He's also controversial, not least for pursuing a $10 million lawsuit against researchers who claimed his work was flawed. So, again, right? He couldn't hash it out. He had to actually launch a lawsuit to get the vicious scum to back off because he denigrated nuclear. And obviously your best solution is geothermal. Why would you look anywhere else? How could you look anywhere else? Putin is dead. Rumors of a coup. Anxiety about nuclear weapons. Is Vladimir Putin dead? I'm pretty sure that would be big news if it was true. And they put it in there enough times that I don't believe he's dead. The Ukrainian President Zelensky to leak the possibility that Putin is no longer alive. Now, it wouldn't surprise me, but I doubt it. He's extremely protected, right? If he was dead, then they had to blow up a small city to get him. U.S. now considering to invade Russia, New York Times. Well, who owns New York Times, right? Amazon.com. And New York Times has always been weaponized against the population since its whole existence. It's never been a media that stood for the population or for the species. It's an industry-controlled media. But it's a popular media, right? And it's quoted all over the place. And so it's one of those legacy medias that really shouldn't exist. Somebody should buy it and dissolve it. Its history is despicable. Marshall Islands could receive billions on a renegotiated U.S. treaty. So what they're trying to do, because China wants the Marshall Islands too, but I mean, you know, I got a study from 2019. Let me bring it up. If I can find the bloody thing. Yeah. The short version. This is a study from 2019 of just gamma cesium-137 contamination in fruit from the northern Marshall Islands, extending over 1 million square kilometers, severely impacted by radioactive fallout from the testing. Well, so that's a nuclear, that's not testing, that's a nuclear war. When you got 1 million square kilometers contaminated from testing, that's actually a nuclear war. You can pretend it's not, but that's a nuclear war. That's worse than a nuclear war, I think, isn't it? And this is decades later. So it's not, you got to stay in your bomb shelter for decades, not 2 weeks. Like the story at the beginning, right? So what they're about, what that's all about, the story there is about they want to kind of they want to take over the Marshall Islands, the Americans do, because of China. Because it's like the Cuban crisis, right, where the Soviets were in Cuba, which was right off the coast of America. The Marshall Islands is seen the same way when China is put into context. Hockey Day in Canada wraps up final day in Owen Sound. We covered that last Thursday, I believe. A number of the booths were set up at the park, including Bruce Power in Canada and the Nuclear Innovation Institute. And these are scumbags. And even like Hockey Day in Canada, where you're supposed to be able to get away from all this political nonsense and demons, actual demons, which is nuclear industry, they had to infiltrate that. And not only that, I mean, look who the sponsor is, Scotiabank. But it's supposed to be a day for people to get out and just be sports. Like, these are not professional sports. These are just the average Canadian. It's supposed to have a day of fun. And you got the two nuclear organizations there to manipulate them. That is frightening. And that is panic, by the way. That's more evidence of panic. And that's blind panic on top of that to do something like that. Hockey is in our blood, yeah? And so is Bruce Power. The fuel pools are always hemorrhaging into your communities, don't you know? So, folks, Sizewell C to explore innovative waste heat. Well, Sizewell C is not built yet. And what they call waste heat, because China's doing an experiment where they're heating homes with, instead of just dumping it right back into the rivers or the oceans, they're running pipes into homes and heating the homes. And using that as justification that nuclear has some redeeming qualities, which it doesn't. Like, just imagine you got a roommate, and the roommate kicks the shit out of you every day but cooks supper for you. Puts a napkin on you and gets you a glass of water. And then after you eat, they kick the shit out of you again. That's what the nuclear industry does. The nuclear industry is nobody's friend. And Sizewell C is surrounded by farms. Right? It's surrounded by farms. So why are you engineering a new facility that is surrounded by farms? These are questions that everybody needs to ask themselves. I got another question. Should the pro-nuclear be grinded up to feed the species now that they killed off the ocean's food chain? And we quantified those assertions at the beginning of the show. We do it every day anyway, but we got a resounding yes. I see we got a little bit of span. A few people saying no, but they'll come over to our side when their children dies of leukemias and cancers. Bill Gates says Australia nuclear ban is political. No, they have a ban. It's a ban. It's legislation, Bill. And since when did Bill Gates, who mean anything? You're not even Australian. And Gates is part of the new scale small modular reactors that don't exist. He's never been there himself. And so they ask him a question, and then the media just plugs it everywhere. Bill Gates says, but it's completely out of context. Because they don't have anybody in the nuclear industry to put on a pedestal. So they have the couple of billionaires like idiot machines like Elon Musk and Bill Gates. They'll put on a pedestal and say, see, nuclear's good. But it doesn't work that way, morons. The billionaires also throwing support behind gas as a stepping stone. That's so awesome. The industry, the other activists will come kick the shit out of them now. So the world's 15 biggest ships create more pollution than all the cars in the world. Bill Gates doesn't mention it. Neither does the pro-nuclear industry. They blame your tin cans, your pop bottles, your plastic, as if your military-industrial complex produces more pollution than humanity could ever dream of. Nuclear missile-based cancers. So they have to change the tritium in these every 12 years. They have to replenish tritium because it decays by 50%, right? And tritium, which is harmless, makes nuclear weapons double and triple and quadruple the power. But it's harmless. Well, why does it do that particular trick then if it's harmless? If it's just like water, why not just use water? Because the industry is so... They told the same lies now for 80 years, and each generation just regurgitates the same lie. They can't tell you a different one because all of a sudden they're going to say, wait a second, you just lied to us for 80 years? Because people are not actually... They're gullible, but they're not stupid per se. They will work it out. So there's clusters of cancers from the people that worked in the silos. And I disrespect these people because they're willing to push a button for a paycheck that means they can't cash their paycheck anymore. Which to me is the epitome of stupid, right? They're going to get their own medical professionals to gather data to learn more for the military. Like, there's zero possibly going to get the truth from something that makes a living by killing everything. Putin Alley warns of global catastrophe over West's fresh weapons delivery. Well, America controls NATO. NATO's 28 militaries. And NATO, the only reason Ukraine is even alive today is because NATO's flooded Ukraine with weapons as a proxy war. They're letting Ukraine do the fighting. But it's evident that they're shipping weapons because they brag about it in the medias. And these are real weapons we're talking about that they're shipping in. Remember, how they were shipping Javelin anti-aircraft missiles and Stinger missiles from Canada, anti-tank missiles. And we're talking tens of thousands at a time. And that were decisive and effective in battles many times now that Ukraine didn't have during the invasion. And the weapons, they were doing bake sales in schools, and children on streets were having lemonade stands to raise money to give to NATO so that Ukraine could have weapons. They were holding fundraisers. They were selling hot dogs in schools to raise the money so Ukraine could buy weapons from the weapons producers to fight off. And this was propaganda, right? It was symmetrical. The media is a dangerous, dangerous weapon. So they wrote, Vladimir Putin's, one of the political parties wrote, if Washington and NATO countries supply weapons will be used to strike civilian cities in Russia and attempt to seize our territory that they captured, as they threaten, this will lead to retaliatory measures using more powerful weapons. Which is, was interpreted as nuclear weapon strikes. And you can't rule anything out because Vladimir Putin, Angela Merkel, Justin Trudeau, many, many past, present leaders in key positions in key government agencies, major NATO countries, were part of the Young Global Leader, World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab's Young Global Leaders decades ago, had all participated at a young age, and now they've come to fruition. Now they're young. Now they're old global leaders, right? And so this is how this industry likes to work. Remember Patrick Clausen? Let me play that 1 minute clip of Patrick Clausen from the Washington Institute. I could usually find it. There she goes. So I put pictures in this to help articulate it. He's going to talk. You see, very hard to see how this president get us to. You're talking about Obama at the time. How this president get us to war with Iran, and he said the way we normally get to war with a country.
I frankly think that crisis initiation is really tough, and it's very hard for me to see how the United States president can get us to war with Iran. Some people might think Mr. Wilson wanted to get us into World War I. You may recall he had to wait for the Lusitania episode. Some people might think that Mr. Johnson wanted to send troops to Vietnam. You may recall he had to wait for the Gulf of Tonkin episode. We didn't go to war with Spain until the until the Maine exploded. And may I point out that Mr. Lincoln did not feel he could call out the Federal Army until Fort Sumter was attacked, which is why he ordered the commander at Fort Sumter to do exactly that thing which the South Carolinians had said would cause an attack. Some people might think that Mr. Roosevelt wanted to get us into World War II, as David mentioned. You may recall we had to wait for Pearl Harbor. So if, in fact, the Iranians aren't going to compromise, it would be best if somebody else started the war.
It would be best if somebody else
I frankly think that crisis initiation...
So he just said all the previous wars were staged false flag wars. That's a stunning statement, by the way. So the seagulls are not feeding on our coastlines anymore. They're not picking up mussels and snails, and sea urchins, and dropping them on the sidewalk and the roads anymore at low tide. No, they're eating at McDonald's. We've lost the planet because of nuclear industry. All the bright lights of Hollywood have worked diligently to brainwash you. Duck and Cover, Simpsons, Spider-Man, the Hulk, there's an absurd list of it. And they turn the average person into a zombie. You can't actually have a conversation with them. a lot of that could be cured if you watch some of my programs, I'm pretty sure. But not all of it. The scientist who tried to save the world is a fantastic story. I'm not going to do it justice, but it's worth reading. It has been 65 years since U.S. chemist Linus Pauling submitted his petition against nuclear testing, an adequate time to recall the story of one of the world's most important scientists of the 20th century. He was a Nobel Prize winner, too, for chemistry. And he petitioned each nuclear bomb test spreads an added burden of radioactive elements over every part of our world. And that's unequivocally true. Each added amount of radiation causes damage to the health of the human beings all over the world, and every bird and every insect, the fungus, the bacteria. And without the fungus and bacteria, what we're seeing is the forests don't break down anymore. The litter doesn't break down. The foliage doesn't break down because you don't have the fungus and the bacteria which supports that ecosystem that would normally break down the litter, the foliage in the forest, right? And so it gathers up over several years, and then you have lightning strikes, and you have these out of control fires now because it didn't recycle itself like it normally would do, right? Because you got rid of the bacteria and the fungus. And you can't have species, by the way, without bacteria and fungus, so eventually everything falls. He also had a petition signed by 11,000 scientists from around the world, which he submitted to United Nations, who shouldn't exist. And their entire history is predicated upon deceit and dishonesty and deception. They broke the back of our planet. They broke the back of our planet and pretended it was for our good, right? That's the United Nations right there for you, look, in a nutshell. Activists call for U.S. apology and justice over the Marshall Islands nuclear test. When they have babies out there, they call them jellied babies because they're so disfigured and disformed. They have no resemblance to a human. And as I showed you earlier, over 1 million square miles of the Bikini Atolls, the Marshall Islands, is too radioactive to be habitable. How much of that is breeding ground? How much of that is the nursery of the ocean? Because you're talking 1 million square kilometers of atolls. So they took all the most precious, wonderful oases in our oceans, like Christmas Island, like the French Polynesian Islands, like Montebello, the Marshall Islands, and they destroyed them. These rare tropical paradises, these were tropical paradises. And in the 50s and 60s and 70s, the nuclear industry done everything it could to destroy every tropical paradise on our planet, and basically now has succeeded. And there's no end to it. And we got to end it. We have to stand tall. This is our watch. We're responsible. Not somebody else. And I take it serious. We are obligated. It's our obligation. Not just under the Bill of Rights, the Magna Cartas, the Constitutions, but we have a responsibility to protect the species, the 9 million precious species that are decimated by the endless, relentless assault from the nuclear industry's radioactive fallout for 8 decades. And one thing we know about the nuclear industry is it's a coward industry. Well, we're going to end the poll, I guess, on a wonderful 49 votes. Should the pro-nuclear be ground up to feed to the species now that they killed off the ocean's food chain? And we quantified that assertion at the beginning where I showed you the documentation from the research, multiple year research expeditions from Vancouver, British Columbia to Alaska. And that took my soul doing that. And I probably will never recover from it in many ways. To see the entire coastline stripped and the world in denial was too much. And so I'm still here to tell the story because the world refuses to acknowledge it, and that's not acceptable. And I refused to let them get away with it. And my solution was to educate the population so they can never get rid of the truth. It can never disappear. And I can guarantee you we won the battle of the truth. It's now we have to wake the planet up also. But the industry is failing because that truth is undeniable. I'm censored because that truth is undeniable, but that doesn't mean anything to me. I'm not going away. I'm certainly not giving up. I'm not capable of giving up. It's not in my lexicon. It's not in my language. So we end the poll. Let's do a shout out. Adrian Johnson, good night everybody. Richard McCann, John Shiflett, hugs for everybody. Have a great night. Great day tomorrow. James Lucet, a great phone call earlier. We appreciate that. Albert, good night everybody. Blue Jay, Savannah's Fort, John Curtis, it was a pretty good show tonight. We had lots and lots of good stuff. Tab Bats, thank you. Peaceware, all those who were not in the comment section, hi everybody. Who's watching this later, thank you for finding the time, the courage, the fortitude. Paul Tippy, San Diego Pete, sending hugs for Kevin Blanche too. Daryl Murray, Provoke, Civilian Warrior, another Gmail, Stephen Young, hi Stephen, MGod 20 Coasts, Fast Thinker, Jeff Poor. Oh, we did get Kevin Blanche here earlier. Hi, Kevin. Not there right now, but he visited. That's awesome. We're almost through it, and we'll get back to the most recent comments in a second. Dana Nasana, I was worried. I'd never seen Dana last night. I figured he got caught up in something else, but you never know. Kevin Marble, because he's always here, right? So when he doesn't show up, that's something you got to think about. Rich Young, almost through. Don Vincent, James Ward, Christopher Leiber. Gee, we had lots and lots of people chat by tonight. Yeah, good night, Dana. Alrighty, that's good stuff. We made it through. Did it take us tonight? Just 2 hours, 10 minutes. If you made it this far, don't forget to give us a thumbs up. Costs us little, might go a long way, you never know. Yeah, looks good. Okay, that's it. Have a great night. We'll see everybody tomorrow night. One thing we know for sure is the nuclear industry never takes a break, so we can't either. And I'm not sure what tomorrow night. I do got 500 studies on Fukushima that I wanted to try to dig into. It's gonna make a great video. Good night, everybody. We'll see everybody tomorrow night, regardless. You take care. Have a great day tomorrow. I'll talk to everybody pretty quicky soon here.